Welcome. My name is Christopher Paisley. I'm a Philadelphia public school teacher, and this is my YouTube channel, Inside White Fragility. Today, I would like to discuss something called Action Civics, which is political protest for class credit. Now, we've all heard about critical race theory. This has jumped up onto the radar in a big way, and everybody is really talking about this now. Critical race theory was going on under the radar for years, for decades. It really came to a head recently, but it was around, and the troubling thing is not many people, not many conservatives, I guess, really were aware of this until recently. But critical race theory now is kind of has a new partner in crime, I guess you could say, and the partner would be something called Action Civics. Action Civics is now going to go hand in hand with critical race theory. Action Civics is going to help continue to usher in critical race theory into now history and social studies courses. And this is something that's concerning. It's interesting the way this kind of progressive agenda creeps its way into education, because by the time you see it, it's really almost too late. Critical race theory has been around for such a long time, and now there's a pushback against it. But now there's this new kind of idea or approach evolving called Action Civics, again, which is going to help usher in critical race theory. It's funny because if you look at technology as a kind of analogy, people say that by the time a cell phone or a computer comes out, the technology is already old. They've already had something new and better and more improved to replace it. And that's kind of what it's like with sometimes progressive agendas or these progressive approaches. By the time they come out, it's already old and there's something new in the works. And this Action Civics is the new thing that's in the works, and it's going to be coming up onto the radar very soon. So I'd like to talk about it. So what is Action Civics? Okay, Action Civics basically is replacing citizenship with partisanship. It's turning education into activism. It's not teaching students how to think, but what to think. It's the same old thing. It's indoctrination. And it's basically a progressive agenda that's being pushed in. All right, it's called Action Civics. Now, it sounds great because people on both sides of the political aisle, and I believe the majority of Americans, say, hey, we need civics. We need to get back to the basics in education. We need to teach children, especially in K-12 schools, about civics. What is the country? How does our government work? The history of our country, how they can get involved, how they can become, informed citizens and active citizens, so they can help, continue to make this country one of the greatest countries in the world. So everybody's on board with civics. We need more civics. But Action Civics, as you can see by the qualifier, the word action, it changes civics. It's not really this traditional way to present civics in a neutral, non-biased way, objective way. Action Civics puts it puts a bias on it. It puts this spin on it. So again, it's making civics, but from kind of a progressive point of view, a progressive agenda, and it's dressing it up under civics, but there's a lot of baggage underneath, which I want to talk about. So where is this all happening? Where's this all coming from? So recently, under Joe Biden and Biden's Department of Education, there was this new act proposed, and funny enough, interestingly enough, it's gotten bipartisan support. The name of this act, it's called Civics Secures Democracy Act. Again, Americans all want civics. They think it's a way to secure our democracy. And this got bipartisan support. All right, there were a couple of Republicans, one in the House, one in the Senate, who signed on to this. And of course, they're Democrats. So this supposedly this bipartisan push to bring civics back into American education. But it's not really doing that. And again, this is why I want to take a closer look at what this really is. What is the Civics Secures Democracy Act? And then what is Action Civics? And what do we really need to know about this? Because it's coming up on the radar. So there's a writer, his name is Stanley Kurtz, and he is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And he wrote a few really excellent articles in the National Review that really brought this up. One of them was called The Greatest Education Battle of Our Lifetimes. It was published in the National Review, I believe, in March. and he talked about some things that you need to be aware of with this bill, not only with the bill, the Civics Secures Democracy Act, but also Action Civics. So one of the things that he brought up is that this kind of, this new bill, this Action Civics, is a de facto national curriculum in the politically charged subject areas of history and civics. All right, every administration is going to try and bring in, obviously, their agenda. Obama did it with Common Core, but when Obama did it, he left out the area of history and civics for the most part, because people say, well, you can't be that blatant and just bring in things about history as if you want to change or rewrite history of the United States and civics, because it can become very partisan. So Obama didn't even go there. Well, this goes there. So it's really a de facto national curriculum in the areas of history and civics, okay? And what it does is it attempts to develop a set of national incentives, measures, and penalties that effectively force critical race theory and action civics into states and localities, just like Obama did with Race to the Top money, and I believe Bush was doing with No Child Left Behind. You can incentivize your educational directives by giving money to school districts and states that bring in your policies and your approaches. You give them money, and that's what's happening with the Biden push with this Action Civics, and again with the Civics Secures Democracy Act. It's going to give grant money to all these districts, so they're going to bring this stuff in. Okay, so it appropriates $1 billion for federal grants to support K-12 curriculum development, teacher training, and research on the K-12 teaching of history and civics. That's the way it's proposed. So it's going to give $1 billion for civics, quote unquote civics. So they're going to bring this stuff in. All right. So the priority goes to grants that support what is called evidence-based practices. This is where we get into the partisanship of this whole thing. All right. So what are evidence-based practices? And again, Stanley Kurtz has researched this, and he's looked through the bill and he's read it line by line, and he really brings all this stuff out. And what it does is, what evidence-based practices are, where the money's going to go to the school districts who use evidence-based practices. They are really troubling teaching techniques favored by the movement for action civics. Okay, and they involve this. These are the teaching practices. Directing teachers to discuss current social and political controversies in class. So you're going to bring up these kind of controversies in class. Okay, whether it's going to be done in a neutral fashion, probably not. Whether they're going to show both sides of the issues of the issue of these controversies, probably not. Because when it comes to critical race theory, there is no discussion. Critical race theory is you're getting one side, you're getting the quote-unquote social justice side of things, and there is no other side. So that's directing teachers to discuss these kinds of events. Black Lives Matter, climate change, things like that. All right. Another thing that's in evidence-based practices, out-of-class political protests and lobbying for course credit. In the bill, it is called projects and experiential learning. So they're going to use quote-unquote experiential learning, which literally requires students to, outside of class, get involved in political protests, political action for class credit. It's in the bill. Okay. Now, again, it's proposed supposedly as neutral. But if you take a look at what's going on, again, climate change, Black Lives Matter, things like this, defunding police, breaking down the nuclear family in terms of Black Lives Matter objectives, the disruption of the Western nuclear family, globalization and socialism over capitalism and meritocracy and individualism, things like that. It's going in that direction. So is it neutral? Is it objective? That's the question you have to ask yourself. And it doesn't seem like it is. Now, here's something interesting that Stanley Kurtz brings up. There was a critique of Action Civics. It was called Making Citizens. There was this 2017 report for the National Association of Scholars. Okay, this report called Making Citizens in 2017. It was done for the National Association of Scholars by David Randall. So he studied, I believe, dozens and dozens of these kind of action civics classes to really see, were they neutral or did they have a bias? Well, guess what they found? Like 85 or 90% of these so-called experiential practices and projects that required students to go out and get active, 85, 90% of them were for left-of-center progressive agendas. Okay, because these teachers steer the students in that way, and they're not going out, talking about pro-life. They're not going out and getting active for pro-life. They're not getting active for, in support of the Second Amendment. They're not going out and getting active for border security. They're going out and getting active for the Green New Deal. They're going out and getting active for defunding police. So it's not neutral even though it's presented as being neutral. Okay, one of the other teaching techniques that is supposedly a evidence-based practice that would get the funding would be internships with lobbying and advocacy organizations for course credit. This is called service learning in the bill. So if you not only get active, but you go out and you have an internship, literally, you have an internship with a lobby group or an activist organization, okay, again, the far majority of these are left of center, progressive organizations where the students are going to be encouraged to work for them. Again, there was a report called Making Citizens for the National Association of Scholars in 2017, and it proved it. It showed it. It studied all of these activist civics, action civics, and this stuff, and it's all left of center. So is this objective? Is this a way to teach civics to students? Is this teaching kids how the country works, how the government works? Or is it turning them into political activists for leftist causes? All right. Another part of this this Biden Education Department incentive for this, where's the grant money going to go, under these evidence-based practices, is something called media literacy. Okay, programs in media literacy are also marked as a priority. They're going to get the money. So what is media literacy in these teaching practices in these school districts if they're going to bring this stuff in? They supposedly warn students away from dangerous conspiracy theories. So Action Civics also wants to give kids supposed media literacy, but what it's really doing is it's saying these are the media sources that are quote unquote real, and these are the media sources that are quote unquote fake news. Okay, these sources with these points of view, with this spin, with these perspectives are the ones that are legitimate, and these are the ones that we're going to use. These sources and these, ideas are not legitimate. They're conspiracy theories, et cetera, et cetera. So they're going to talk about media literacy, and again, it's going to go through the lens of partisanship. It's not media literacy, according to this bill, is not going to be, here's a news source that says this, and here's a news source that says this. Here's the pro, here's the con, here's the pro news source, here's the con news source. Let's look at this. Let's look at Fox. Let's look at CNN. Let's look at the National Review, and let's look at Mother Jones. Let's look at the New York Times. Let's look at the New York Post. Let's look at the Washington Post. Let's look at, a conservative news source, or the Washington Times. It's not going to do that. It doesn't appear as though it's going to do that. It appears as though the news organizations and the media outlets that have the policies and the perspectives of the left of center organizations are going to be the ones that are the legitimate media literacy, and then the students, I guess, are going to be pushed away from the other points of view and the other media sources. Now, of course, in the bill, it doesn't say that. But again, when you look at what's going on in terms of media analysis, look at search engines, look at Twitter, look at Facebook. I mean, this is going to be a cause for concern. Again, it's not objective. It's not just teaching students about the way the government works and about civics. It's teaching students about getting active, progressive policies, and progressive news sources. Okay? So here's something interesting as well. Biden's Department of Education has just released the text of a proposed new rule establishing priorities for grants in American history and civics education programs. So just recently, in addition to this bill, which again is called Civics Secures Democracy Act, Biden has just put out this new rule that's going to prioritize certain aspects of civics education, action civics. So I just want to go through these two priorities so you can see exactly what they're all about. So here's priority number one. Projects that incorporate racially, ethnically, culturally, and linguistically diverse perspectives into teaching and learning. So this is where you're talking about this racial, ethnic, and culturally diverse stuff. Now, on the surface, obviously, that's a good idea. That's a good thing. We want to make sure it's diverse. We want to make sure it's diverse across race, religion, it's diverse across language. So everybody gets an equal opportunity to have an education and become a part of, the country and be a good citizen. But when you go down into it and you see the language that it uses, it's critical race theory language. It's critical race theory language that's supposedly, this neutral objective perspective, when we know that critical race theory is not neutral and objective. It's actually very partisan, and it's actually very intolerant because it doesn't allow you to argue or debate ideas. All right. So here's what it says. according to priority number 1. There is a growing acknowledgement of the importance of including in the teaching and learning of our country's history both the consequences of slavery and the significant contributions of Black Americans to our society. This acknowledgement is reflected, for example, in the New York Times landmark 1619 Project and in the resources of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History. That was right in priority number 1. That's in the text of this proposed new rule from the Biden Education Department. Now here's funny. So here's the funny thing. These two things that were brought up, the 1619 Project and the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Let's look at the 1619 Project. Talking about accuracy, talking about media literacy. Okay, Sean Wilentz, who's a professor of history at Princeton University, wrote a letter to the New York Times requesting the publication correct its basic mistakes. The 1619 Project, historians across the board, left of center, right of center, from all political persuasions, they all agreed, historians, Pulitzer Prize-winning historians, that the 1619 Project had so many historical inaccuracies, it wasn't accurate history. Even the author of the project, Nicole Hannah-Jones, admitted it's not history, it's journalism. That's what she said, which basically means it's just politics. It's not history. It's more about political activism than it is about really historical accuracy. So Sean Wilentz actually wrote to the New York Times and said, you might want to correct these inaccuracies because we want to try and keep this historically accurate. And the Times didn't do it because the Times agreed with Nicole Hannah-Jones that this is more of a social justice movement to look at this in this new way, but not really accurate in terms of history. For example, this is the common mistake that everybody talks about. In the 1619 Project, they say that the United States, America, fought the Revolutionary War against Britain to preserve slavery. That was the number one reason why they fought the Revolutionary War against Britain. It was to preserve slavery. It wasn't to gain independence. It wasn't to become their own nation, to try and bring about liberty or democracy or this new experiment called America. It was about simply, or one of the main things it was about, the primary thing it was about, was to preserve slavery. Things like that. Kids are being taught things like that about America. It's based in this oppression and slavery. It wasn't an experiment. It wasn't this new idea to break away from the old way to try and find a place where we can have democracy and freedom of speech and all these things. Again, it's through the lens of oppression, a Marxist lens of oppressors and oppressed. So that was mentioned as one of the priorities, the 1619 Project. Now, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History, again, there was that pamphlet that was called The Aspects and Assumptions of Whiteness, which came out last summer in July, that said objective truth, linear math, the scientific method, all of these things were aspects of white culture. Okay, they weren't necessarily true universally. They were white cultural appropriation. I'm saying that correctly, and that these things were of concern. Literally, things like objective truth. Because through a critical race theory lens, there is no such thing as objective truth. It's all about lived experience. It's postmodern. There is no truth. There is no universal ideas of fairness and respect. It's all culturally relative. Same thing with linear math. Linear math is somehow now racist and oppressive because it's rooted in white supremacy. The same thing with the scientific method. Robin DiAngelo, Ibram X. Kendi, all of these new people who espouse critical race theory, they say the scientific method is based in white Western patriarchy, and that the scientific method and the science, using objective science is somehow white or it's somehow racist. So these are the ideas that were being put forth by the African American Museum of History and Culture, which is cited in this under the guise of racially, ethnically, and culturally and linguistically diverse perspectives. All right. So this is some of the ideas that are contained in here. Now, another part of this priority within this special, priority, who's going to get the money? Which schools are going to get the money? Schools that do things like this. Schools across the country are working to incorporate anti-racist practices into teaching and learning. As the scholar Ibram X. Kendi has expressed, an anti-racist idea is any idea that suggests the racial groups are equals in all of their apparent differences, that there is nothing right or wrong with any racial group. Anti-racist ideas argue that racist policies are the cause of racial inequities. It is critical that the teaching of American history and civics creates learning experiences that validate and reflect the diversity, identities, histories, contributions, and experiences of all students. Great. But who do they use as the spokesperson? Who do they reference? Ibram X. Kendi. Ibram X. Kendi presents people with the false dilemma, the fallacy of the false dilemma. You're either an anti-racist and you agree with all of his philosophies and policies, or you are a racist. There is no discussion. There is no reflection. There is no debate. You're not looking at both sides of issues. Now, this is supposedly about critical thinking. This is supposedly about making students, great citizens, active citizens, so that they can think and they can understand ideas. Well, critical race theory doesn't allow you to look critically at both sides of an argument. It doesn't do that at all. And as a matter of fact, some of this stuff with Kendi and critical race theory is against individualism. It is against meritocracy. It does not believe in a national cultural identity because everything is supposedly culturally relative. And if you look at a national cultural identity, it's racist. It's white supremacy. Okay, so you have that whole priority. Now, here's the biggest irony. When you look at it next to priority number 2. When you look at priority number 2, it is the promotion of information literacy skills. Again, it's something we talked about, the promotion of literacy skills. Now, here's the irony. How are you promoting literacy skills when you are saying that the scientific method is racist? How are you promoting literacy skills when you're saying that there's no such thing as objective truth? How are you promoting literacy skills when you say that any news organization or news source or writer who disagrees with your point of view is racist and shouldn't be taught? Okay, how is that promoting literacy skills? All right, so it's funny. It's like, hey, we need more civics. We need more civics in our curriculum because we want to support America. We want to make America a great place. And everybody's for civics, you know what I mean? We need to know how the government works. We need to how to become a great citizen, an active citizen to help America. And at the same time, America is a fundamentally racist place. America is an oppressive country. There shouldn't be a national identity known as America. The free market's a bad thing. Individualism is something we need to disrupt. Meritocracy is something we need to disrupt and get rid of. Whites are oppressors and they're privileged, and people of color are victims and they're oppressed. So how do you have these two priorities and put them side by side? It just doesn't make any sense. It's just ridiculous. But this is contained inside this new special proposal within Biden's new Action Civics. And the name of the bill, again, I want to keep repeating it. The name of the bill is called Civics Secures Democracy Act, and inside it is this Action Civics. All right. So I want to wrap up with I want to read a couple of pieces that, again, Stanley Kurtz, who is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, he wrote a piece for the American Mind, which you should really read, and I'm going to link it in the description of this video. And the title of it was called Action Civics Replaces Citizenship with Partisanship. And I want to read some excerpts to sum this up because it makes some great points about this so-called Action Civics. Okay? Yet what distinguishes classroom-based protest and lobbying from manipulation of a student's untutored prejudices in the service of a teacher's or school's political agenda? In practice, as well as theory, the answer is far too little. As one observer rightly put, when action proceeds from unexamined assumptions, the result is not learning but indoctrination. So basically what he's saying here is kids are going to have their own viewpoints and own ideas about topics. But if you're a teacher who is kind of massaging or helping, in a way, kind of build or develop a student's, political viewpoints on issues, a teacher could easily do that. A teacher's not supposed to do that. I would never do that. When I teach my students, I give them an issue and I show them both sides and I let them think through it themselves. But there's plenty of teachers who kind of groom students into thinking about things in a certain way. So kids are already going to be manipulated in certain situations. I don't agree with it, but they're going to be predisposed to have certain political viewpoints. When you tap into those predisposed, assumptions about things and you make them active, is that really neutral? Is that really being a neutral, objective teacher? Is that really civics? Is that really what we want to be doing in schools? Is that education or is that indoctrination? All right. What civic education very deliberately does not attempt to do is supply students with substantive political positions. That is for the students themselves to determine as free individuals in the fullness of time. Our need is not for collective action per se, but for civic action tempered by regard for the rights of others. The ability to explore contending perspectives with patience and respect, including the strength of character to hold one's own political convictions up to scrutiny, is a virtue essential to the preservation of our republic. That is why debate in various forms has long been a practicum of civics. So what civics is really about is looking at both sides, being able to argue both points of view, being able to hold your own position up under scrutiny of another position, right? You have one viewpoint, I have one viewpoint. You have one position, I have one position. We debate respectfully. We respect each other's points of view. Maybe we even try and debate from the opposite point of view to understand other perspectives. That's not what critical race theory is doing. Critical race theory is shutting down, completely shutting down any opposing point of view of things that are considered social justice. Everyone knows that critical race theory is very intolerant, and it does not open up the floor for debate, especially from people who are considered, white supremacy culture. Their voices are supposed to be silenced because supposedly they're privileged and they've for far too long had the stage in their points of view, and their voices are supposed to be shut down. So you're bringing in voices of people of color. That's what D'Angelo says. That's not about debate. Okay? So here's more from Stanley Kurtz. A few more passages and I'm going to wrap up. Action civics, to the contrary, skips a step, moving uncritically to turn grievance and anger into protest and lobbying. Too often this has the effect of forestalling self-examination and dampening tolerance of alternative perspectives. Critical self-examination and thoughtful debate are easily avoided in the heat of collective political action. That is why civics education is not the same as political action per se. Civic education is instead a preparation for and a prerequisite to mature political life. So you have to learn to freely debate ideas and respect freedom of speech. We all know that in higher education, in universities, that freedom of speech is being shut down. Students who disagree are being silenced. We all know that this is happening, and it's starting to happen in K-12 classrooms. Okay, recognizing the essential contestability of your own point of view is the preface to liberty. I want to read that again. Recognizing the essential contestability of your own point of view is the preface to liberty. Kendi doesn't do that. Kendi doesn't recognize the essential contestability of his own point of view. If you disagree with Kendi, you're branded, you're labeled, and you're booted out. You're a racist. If you contest Robin DiAngelo's point of view, you suffer from white fragility. I mean, critical race theory doesn't do any of this stuff. Okay, neither does action civics. Learning the ways in which every policy position features strengths, weaknesses, trade-offs, potentially unintended consequences, and often error encourages us to grant freedom of speech to others rather than merely to demand it for ourselves. Yet by intentionally agitating grievance and at times even glamorizing the refusal of angry student activists to accord a respectful hearing to contrary views, action civics resists acknowledgement of the essential contestability of opinion. In this, it both reflects and exacerbates the tendencies now weakening our fundamental freedoms. And that's so true. Critical race theory does not allow for the contestability of your own of positions that disagree with it. It doesn't open the floor to debate. It does not teach students how to think, but what to think. And if you don't agree, you need to take a closer look at the teachings of D'Angelo and Kendi and others and critical race theory since its inception. It has nothing to do with objective truth and everything to do with power and politics and agenda. And it's going into K-12 schools, okay? It is a sign of our times that such statements have since been modified to reflect a changed vision of public education, one that takes the inculcation of particular political viewpoints as a positive mission. Particularly in the context of public education, that vision is at odds with the principles and habits of liberty. I want to read that again. It is a sign of our times that such statements have been modified to reflect the changed vision of public education, one that takes the inculcation of particular political viewpoints as a positive mission. Particularly in the context of public education, that vision is at odds with the principles and habits of liberty. Loose translation, today, a lot of K-12 schools and teachers believe that we're going to take a position on an issue because we're right. and we're more morally superior than other people, and this position is right. And because it's right, the ends justify the means, and we're going to push this as a mission. We're not going to let the students think through it themselves. We're not going to have an open floor for debate. We're going to push this position on them because it's the right thing to do. Yeah, according to who? According to who? That's Action Civics. It works hand in hand with critical race theory, and it's something we really need to be aware of, especially as teachers.